Okay, this is the lantern that got me started on this presentation about pinwork in the Vesterheim collection. It's kind of an interesting looking lantern, and I was able to get the accession notes and read that it was donated to the Vesterheim, or I believe it was to Luther, in the 1920s. It had belonged to a family that, in the accession notes, it says they brought it from Norway in 1855. And it had belonged to the family that had lived in the same home, and the elderly owner had apparently passed away, and the family donated this lantern to the museum. Next slide. Whoops, that one was the one we deleted. There we go. There we go. That's the one I want to look at. So I was kind of curious because this is the punched design. Now, there are many punched lanterns in the world. Of course, the metal protects the flame from the wind, and the punched designs allow the light through and allow some ventilation so the candle will burn. But this particular punched design is much more machined looking than most of the lanterns that I see. So I was a little suspicious of this lantern as something that had been brought from the old country. Let's move to the next slide. I put a query out on one of the tinworking Facebook sites that I'm on, and practically immediately got back this patent document. It was patented in the United States in 1855, the year this family emigrated. And the reason it was patented was that the person who designed it had developed certain machinery for quick and efficient production of many lanterns like this. And actually, I did an eBay search and found several available that are all pretty much exactly alike. And now we can take a little break from the slides, and I'll just give an overview of Pinwork. That's not me, but I'm sure I will appear shortly. I liked the story of the lantern because it reminded me of a story from my own family. My great-grandfather had also been a tin worker, and my grandmother proudly showed me a coffee pot. It was, it had been a nice silver plate coffee pot, and she said they'd gotten it at a estate sale, and the bottom had been broken out, and her father had fashioned a new bottom for the coffee pot and then had it plated. And I thought, wow, that's really a great story. And when I learned more about Tinwork, I realized, no, that was the original bottom for that particular coffee pot. But both in the case of the lantern from Norway and in the coffee pot from my grandmother, there was a truth behind it. My great-grandfather was a tin worker and may have repaired the coffee pot, but that wasn't the one. And this family from Norway probably had lanterns in Norway, and they groped through the dark in blizzards in Iowa carrying a lantern also. So it tells the family history, just not exactly the way. The artifacts were more touchstones to remind them of the history than actually connected with that specific story. Okay, Tinwork.
Kitty, I just wanted to take a moment to let you know.
I can't see myself anymore, but I do see that my tin is showing. This is a sheet of tin plate. A tin plate is a product of the Industrial Revolution, a thin sheet of iron, or modern it's steel rather than iron, that's dipped in tin. Because the iron was so thin, it would be very vulnerable to rust, but the tin plating on the outside protects it. It's very pliable, it's so thin, and because it's got the tin plating, it can be used for all sorts of food products, and it doesn't impart any taste to the food. And for lighting, it reflects and adds to the light.
Kitty, we have just a question in the chat. Kathleen is wondering what gauge your tin is.
This particular piece is about 28 gauge. 28 and 30 are fairly standard gauges. 30 is, well, I think I'll show you a lantern later that was made with 30, but it's getting kind of light. And the lighter it is, the more reinforcement it needs with wiring or with swedging. And I'm going to show the punching, like, well, the little triangles on that lantern we looked at earlier were punched. Traditionally, that would be done with a handheld punch and a hammer that would strike. So each hole would represent one blow with the hammer against the punch. A more modern innovation is a punch and guide. This is sort of like a hole punch, and it's got a bottom and top. So that will make a very neat punch. Now those triangles on that lantern we looked at earlier were done with probably a very large press that would punch that whole design all at once. But it would have a bottom die and a top to push the tin, push through the tin. Other tools that would be used, well, this is an early type of shear for cutting tin plate or thin sheet steel. These are more modern shears. In America, after, well, I should go backwards in time. In Europe, in the 1670s, roller mills were developed that could roll iron into very thin sheets. There was really no tin plate available on a commercial level before that. Some tin plating was done very laboriously by hand. But after about 1670, an industry developed, and many, many sheets like this were produced and crated and shipped around. Mostly they were produced, to my knowledge, in England, but they were shipped to America in large numbers. Tinware became a very important product in America because it was inexpensive, lightweight, and people who were moving and traveling and settling in new places could afford it. Okay, so I've shown you the shears. A tin worker would typically have a mallet that's soft. Tin is such a soft metal. Tin sheets by themselves would not be useful because it's so soft. Iron was essential to give some strength to the product. So to shape the tin, you would strike it with a soft mallet that would not scratch and damage the tin. Now, if you can see, this is a stake here. A tin shop would have different stakes to help bend the tin. Some of the bending can be done just by hand, but the tin would be pressed over a stake that had a certain shape. Another type of tool that would be common in a tin shop is called a swedge. This particular swedge is a wide, rounded hammer that would push the tin down into a groove. On some of the lanterns, you'll see bands that are grooved that would be done in a swedge like this. This is a handmade swedge by a blacksmith I know, and this is what European shops would have had in the 16 and 1700s. By the 1800s, there was, in American shops, there was a lot of standardization, and this would be a more standard American 19th century flint. If you study tinwork, you can see the Industrial Revolution taking place as the tools develop and evolve. And now let's go back to the lanterns. We should be at slide, well, I'm not sure if it's 4 or 5 now. 5. There we go. This is a lantern that I made. I was using a pattern that I had gotten from Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, but it's a very standard lantern pattern. The punching varies from much more variation in the punching than in the design of the lantern. Because the tin is thin and pliable, there are certain places where it's reinforced. The door of this lantern the tin has been folded around a wire, and the wire gives it some strength. The tin was cut away where you can see the little latch, and the hinge is actually wrapped around the same wire. The edges, the top and bottom of the body of the tin, the edges actually folded over to make what is called a set-down seam. And you can see that's really a sharp fold. The lantern is held together with solder. You can see the solder along the edges on the cone top, where the two edges of the cone meet, and you can see solder where the latch is attached. Tin takes solder a lot more easily than the iron would by itself, so that became a very reasonable, easy way to assemble and hold a tin product together. Although I say that one of the advantages mentioned in the patent for the first lantern we looked at was that it didn't require as much solder, so that would be a saving for the tinsmith and a saving in time, because soldering takes time. In the 1850s, a new patent would really emphasize efficiency of material and savings of time. Okay, the next slide, that's just a detail of the hinge. You can see how the tin plate was cut and folded back, and the hinge itself is wrapped around the wire. This is, I'm pointing with my finger, but that's the wire running up and down on the left. And so the hinge is wrapped around the same wire that is holding the door, makes the door rigid. Next slide. That's the latch, and you can see how the pin is cut away and the latch is wrapped around the wire, and you can see some solder on the right side where that holds the latch part on the lantern itself. Okay, next slide.
Can you see my cursor if I point to things for you?
I see it, and you're doing a really good job with the cursor.
Great, I just wasn't sure.
Makes me feel like I must be expressing myself a little bit clearly. Okay, this is one of the punches. That would be for making a slit. The lanterns mostly have slits and dots, and they have two different kinds of dots. So this makes a straight slit, and move to the next slide. That makes a dot, but it's kind of a square tip So the dots are actually kind of diamond shaped. They'll have 4 little corners. Next slide, that's another dot. It just makes a neat little round circle. And if you look at lanterns, punched lanterns, you will frequently see those combinations of those 3 punches to make the patterns. Next slide. This is just the surface of a lantern where it has been punched with those different punches, and you can see the slits and then the sort of, well, they're almost star-shaped. That's from the punch with the 4 sides. You can see that the tin itself has been distorted. I punch over a backup block of wood, and the punch goes down into that wood and pushes the tin with it. That's quite different from the punchings in the first lantern I showed you, where it made a neat cutout because it was a punch and die, sort of like a hole punch. But this is much more typical of most of the punched lanterns that I've looked at. Okay, next slide. This is a commercial lantern. It's the same basic pattern that I showed you the first slide of the lantern I made. It's got 2 hinges on the one side and the little hinged latch on the other, and the set down seams top and bottom. This is commercial, and I'm imagining that they have some kind of punch and die setup so they can do the whole sheet of tin in one punch, because they make them and sell them. They usually come from China or India, and they make them and sell them at very low prices. Hand craftsmen can't really compete for price with this. Next slide. So I've been showing you American lanterns, and Pinwork took great strides forward in the United States in the 19th century with the development of a lot of tools for more efficiency. But when I traveled to Norway in 2010 and had the chance to go back into the archives, here was an aisle chock full of tin lanterns, and you can see one very similar to the lanterns that I was just showing you up on the top shelf. And in 2010, I didn't have my mind on it as much. I wish I had spent more time in that aisle and gotten some more pictures and studied those lanterns more completely. So there were such lanterns in Norway. Next slide. Oh, and what do you know? This is from Trois-Rivières in Quebec, from a museum. The same basic type of lantern. They were all over Europe and the Americas. Now let's move to the next slide. This is kind of an interesting engraving from a book published in 1568. The title is The Lantern Maker. Now, something that's interesting to me is that 1568 is well before the time when sheet metal, when rolling mills were developed that could make thin sheets of iron that could be dipped to make tin. So a tin plate would not have been developed yet. This is an earlier generation of the same type of lantern. You can see they have the cone top, the little door. So they're kind of the same and kind of different. Let's move to the next slide. So this is a little later. This is 1763. That's well after the 1670 date for the rolling mill. This is from the Diderot Encyclopedia, and it is called the Pin Shop. You can see on the benches, on the stumps, there are tools, stakes for helping to shape the pin. On the right, there's a stump with a shape that has some rounded ends, and on the left, a flat stake that would be used to make different shapes in the tin plate. and many different shapes. I don't see any lanterns in this, but I'm sure they made lanterns in that shop. Okay, next shot. This is a modern shop in Williamsburg, Virginia, but it's a recreation of a tin shop from the mid-18th century, the 1700s. The tin worker is working over a stake using a mallet. Tools were mostly hand tools, and although pinwork was developed only after the rolling mills, there was sheet metal work going on for centuries, and the sheet metal workers were using stakes that were somewhat similar to these. Next shot. This is the tin shop in Sauter Village, Ohio, and the tin worker there is using a hand-cranked rolling machine. In the 1800s, the 19th century, rolling machines were being developed for more efficient forming of tin plate. And now this is probably a later 19th century machine. The first were produced shortly after 1800, and by 1840, many shops had such machines in the United States. They were being manufactured in the United States and Canada. I don't have any information about the extent to which they were exported, and I have not seen any comparable machines in Europe. Okay, let's go back to the Vesterheim with the next slide. This is a lantern. It also says on its accession notes that it came from Norway, but there is really well-documented provenance. It was donated to the Vesterheim by the Maihaugen Museum in the 1920s as part of a celebration of the 100-year anniversary of Norwegian immigration to the United States. This lantern is of that same basic design that we've been looking at, but it is not made of tin-plated steel. It's made of iron. The material is much thicker than the tin plate that I work with. The lantern, of course, then is heavier. Something that's distinctly different about it is you can see on where the edges of the cone are joined, there are rivets. Rivets are actually punched through the two edges and hammered so that the rivets hold that in place. The bottom of the cone is very loosely bent. It's you may remember looking at the sample lantern I showed before, what a sharp crease the bottom of the cone made. This is probably hammered over a stake to make that curved bend, and then it's bent over the sides of the lantern. The punching is done very much the same way. I'm guessing that was done by eye. The design is somewhat uniform, but doesn't look like it was carefully graphed out. Next slide. This shows the door of that lantern, and as with the joint on the cone, the hinges are separate pieces held onto the lantern with rivets. The edges of the door are not folded. Because the iron is heavier, it probably is strong enough that it doesn't need the extra strength that the wiring would provide or that bending would provide. Also, because it's heavier, it wouldn't be as sharp. The modern pin plate would create a sharp enough edge that it would be uncomfortable to handle that door. without the wiring or the folded edges. Next slide. This lantern is interesting because the bottom of the lantern is wooden. The candle cup is fit into a hole in the wood, and there are some nails that go through the side of the lantern to hold that bottom in place. Next slide. This is the bottom of the lantern, and there's a little patch of iron nailed onto that bottom to prevent the candle cup from sliding out the bottom. So this lantern is very unusual from my experience with Tinwork. I am not sure. I will surmise, without having done extensive research, that it's going back to an earlier tradition, more like the lanterns we saw in that German print from the 1600s than like the modern tin lanterns that I make. It was undoubtedly from Norway. Well, from Norway in the 1920s. We don't know if it was actually made in Norway or if it was an import item. The print we saw was from Germany, so they were producing lanterns like this in other places. Next slide. Okay, this is another lantern that appears to be iron rather than tin plate. It has the rivets holding the pieces together. The hinges are held to the lantern and to the door with rivets. The iron is not folded at the edges for reinforcement. The latch, and I didn't point out the latch on the previous one, the latch on this one appears to be missing, but on the tin lantern I showed you earlier, the latch was hinged. On many of the lanterns that had a latch riveted to the door, the latch gets broken off. It gets a lot of stress opening and closing the lantern. Again, the pattern of punching is done very much like with the punches that I showed you. It seems to be random, done by eye rather, not completely random. The artist had a pattern in mind, but it's done by eye rather than by following any kind of a set pattern. Next picture. This shows the rivets. But this is a little different from the lantern with the wooden bottom. The lantern, this particular lantern does have a set down seam on the bottom. They had more sophisticated tooling than that previous craftsperson, probably a swedge like the one I showed you to make this neat bend along the bottom so that the side of the lantern could be set into the bottom. Next slide. This is just detailing showing the rivet holding the cone. And again, that neat, there was a tooling that was a little more sophisticated than the first lantern. Next slide. That shows the candle cup. And this is a curiosity. I would like to study this a little more when I can get there in person. But I can see this candle cup has tabs and appears to be riveted into the bottom of the lantern. Next slide. But I don't see the rivets on the bottom. I can see some rust, some pits. When I enlarged them, they appeared to be just pits from rust. So it could be a double bottom, or it may be that I just can't see those rivets coming through. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're getting into a thinner material, more tools that are maybe more typical of tin work. You can see the grooves that would be made with a swedge, and they give strength to the thinner sheet also. The set down edges are pretty neatly done at the bottom of the cone, but the hinges are still riveted on. So that, to me, that would support it having been from Norway rather than something that was purchased in this country. That's an older tradition, and it may be that traditions of working with tin didn't transfer even when tin became more available. Again, more questions. I don't have the answers to those, but this is still riveted at the joints, and but it appears to be tin plate, a thinner material, and the shininess makes me think it's plating. Next picture. That's more details of the hinges with rivets. The punching could have been done by eye, or could have, I'm guessing it was done by eye. Next picture. More of the same, that you can see the latch is broken off, and that's kind of typical of the rigid latches. Next picture. More detail of the same lantern. Next. That's the inside of the hinges. His holes are really round looking, so they were punched with a type of punch that had a round, flat face rather than the diamond-shaped face. Okay, and that just shows the bottom with a neatly folded edge, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is another tin lantern, and we have made the transition to solder. Another thing that's a little different about this, the circles, the circle design had to be marked somehow so that the pin worker would make the punches in such a neat circle. That would, well, I suppose there might be an artist who could do that neatly by eye, but I'm guessing it was marked out. Still, the hinges are very unusual, not standard American pinwork hinges, and we'll look at that a little more closely later. Next slide. Okay, that's just a close-up. You can see the hinges are a wire that is actually punched through the side wall of the lantern. But soldered, I don't believe there are any rivets holding the hinge to the door, but the wire pintle part of the hinge goes through the lantern. Okay, next slide. And that shows inside. You can see it better on the bottom. That wire is curled around to hold it in the lantern. And as I say, that's very unusual. I've never seen that before. Now it shows, it doesn't show very well, but in some of the spaces, if you look where the circles were punched, you can see the line. They must have used a compass of some sort to mark circles on the inside of the pin before they punched those holes. Okay, there's the latch. It's not the standard American type latch with a hinge. It's soldered to the door. This one is fortunate it hasn't broken off. It might be because those funny hinges allow the door a little more movement. Next slide. This lantern is unusual. It has, it looks like it has a double candle holder. I'm puzzled by that. One of the problems with this design of lantern is that it heats up and candles go more quickly in that when the lantern is closed. Two candles together would really go quickly, especially that close together. But it appears to be a double candle holder, which is an unusual thing. Okay, next slide. And that, we have solder. Do we also, I think that's just solder. But now I can't even tell if there's a rivet in there. We get some discoloration as the pictures are enlarged, and it's just a little hard to tell. Okay, and there's more of the punching design. Again, the circles were done by drawing a circle on the tin before starting the punching process. Next slide. That's the bottom. The edges were very neatly turned using appropriate tooling. We got lots of pictures of this lantern. Okay, next slide. This is the lantern that I used as the sample for a class I taught last year at the Vesterheim. We made a replica of this particular lantern. I think the punching was probably done by eye. They had some kind of a swedge to reinforce the tin, which gives it strength. And the swedge also is attractive. The edges of the door were folded, but the only wire is on the hinged side. So the hinge is done like the American models, but there's only one hinge, so that's kind of unusual. The latch was not hinged, it had been soldered on the outside. You can see the solder, that latch is long gone. This lantern had a hard life. It's really pretty beat up. Okay, next picture. That's another view of the same lantern. It was unusual in that it has a piece of wood on the inside around the candle holder. Well, that's actually kind of a good innovation. I'm surprised I don't see that more often, because that insulates the candle holder a little bit, so that if the candle burns down, it doesn't melt the solder that holds the candle holder in place. I kind of like that innovation. The edges of the cone and where the doorway is attached is all soldered. So that's a technology that, along with tin plate, the solder had reached Europe and was being used more, assuming that this was made. The accession notes say it was made in Norway. If it was made, it could have been made in this country by somebody who didn't have access to the American pattern yet. Next slide. That's the latch, where the latch was, and you see the remnants of the latch that's still attached to the lantern itself, but the latch on the door has broken off. You can see that it was punched with the diamond-shaped punch, and this is the original lantern with the replica that I made for the class. Measurement-wise, it was very similar. And that particular lantern was also made with about 30 gauge tin. Because it was thin tin, it took its hard life harder. The bottom is quite seriously dinged up from being dropped and hit around a little bit. Okay, next. This is a quite different type of lantern. It's in the Vesterheim collection. It was made using bullseye glass, which is kind of a byproduct of the glass industry. And what interested me particularly about this lantern is the punched design on the cone that is punching that's purely decorative. It doesn't go all the way through the tin and would not allow light to come through. I see that in American coffee pots and boxes, but I've never seen that on a lantern other than this one. It's just one of the things I like about Pinwork. People had a little freedom to experiment with their own designs. Okay, now we've jumped out of lanterns, and I've been curious about Scandinavian pinwork and metalwork in general. So I was talking to Suzanne Kramer, who's a dealer in Scandinavian antiques, and she had a number of sconces like these. These are brass. They were more from Sweden, although she's traveled in both places and wasn't quite sure about some of them. She said she'd seen these in a lot of churches. Let's go to the next slide. She said, this is also from Sweden or Norway, and it's not brass or bronze. It's essentially tinwork, but it's not tin plate that we would use for eating utensils, certainly. It's turn metal that was used in the 19th century as a roofing material. It wouldn't be suitable for food because it's got lead. But somebody was taking excess roofing metal and making candle sconces, again, for small country churches. I guess Suzanne's impression was that the brass ones were for higher end churches, and poorer churches would have these turn metal sconces. So that's a type of metalwork that was being done, and this is some of the punched design that kind of reminds me of the pole rosing and other decorative work done in other materials in the Scandinavian countries, and that's another example of the decoration on that particular candle holder. Okay, and then I think that's it for my slides. So now I get the logo. But something that has interested me, and it's another of the unanswered questions, is who was doing the tin work, like the candle sconces we looked at, maybe the lanterns. When I have asked contemporary Norwegians, several people have told me about travelers, maybe gypsies, or maybe Hungarians, or one Norwegian told me about a group of people called the Font people, and they travel around. Well, I've heard of the travelers or the tinkers in Ireland who similarly travel around and do tin work. So I don't know if there are such people in Norway that do tin work. I haven't found anybody that can tell me much other than that they exist.